Welcome, friends, to the Here I Go Again podcast, where we discuss life, faith, politics, and a whole lot more. I'm your host, Rob Standridge, and I'm glad you're joining us today. So with that, here we go. All right, I want to welcome David Barton to the Here I Go Again podcast. This is our third episode, and so it's such an honor to welcome David Barton, the founder of Wall Builders here. And so welcome, David. How are things with you?
Hey, Senator, good to be with you. They are busy, brother. There's a lot going on. As you know, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, a lot of stuff to be taken care of, for sure.
Well, it's a fallen world, and so appreciate you out there trying to bring people a little bit close to the narrow road. So appreciate that very much. My daughter's here, and she's about to leave. I know you met my wife a couple of weeks ago that I wanted to touch on, but my daughter's Holly. I wanted to introduce you to her real quick.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
So
podcast isn't normal without bringing somebody else in.
Love it.
Well, anyway, you were in Cleveland County at the courthouse here a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, sir.
And really appreciate that you making the trip up here, and you do that all the time. I'm sure you do it all over the country, not just in Oklahoma. So what, just real quickly before I do a little bit more intro stuff, what was that about? And do you see that going on elsewhere in the country?
Yeah, the Cleveland County, you guys and Senator, you've done a great job. You guys in Oklahoma put through so much good legislation in so many areas. And one of the things that you guys put through was to allow the display of In God We Trust on public buildings, to put it on public buildings. And so that happened, and Cleveland County there, Norman, up there and on the outside of the buildings, a really wonderful backlit In God We Trust there, very visible. It's in the courthouses throughout the courthouse as well, or it's in the courtrooms throughout the courthouse. So you guys have done a great job. I got to be there with you and got to give some of the background of that motto. People today think, well, that's God stuff. Government doesn't do that. Well, somebody forgot to tell the founding fathers that, because they're the ones that did so much God in government back at the very beginning. But Franklin actually takes the In God We Trust motto back to 1748. So we're talking, essentially coming up on 280 years of that motto. And for people to think that's inappropriate, it's like, come on, man. That's who America has been from the beginning.
Yeah, they're trying so hard to erase history, but it's difficult when we have people that actually search for the truth and find it. So I want to talk about, kind of where you're at, but I also wanted you to know that I want to touch on this in a little bit, but just shortly before you came here, there was an anti-constitutional rally at the Capitol where they spent several hours, I think, putting words in our founders' mouth and demeaning them. I think even Senator Coburn, a friend of ours from back, we lost him a few years ago, but in this constitutional battle that I fought, and I know you're involved in it. So I want to get back to that, but looking at your rich history, David, and that's just the truth. I know you started out as a youth pastor, but I'm really curious. I was talking to my daughter earlier. How was that transition to, because we hear so much today about, pastors don't belong in this, keep the church in the church. What was that pivotal point for you where it took you from youth ministry to essentially, if not a national, even a global ministry that I feel like you're involved in now? How did that transition happen?
It's very interesting. I go back to growing up in the country here in my town of Aledo. There was 220 people when I was growing up. I rode my horse back and forth to work. This was a country town. In this little country town, we had the world's largest Charolais cattle ranch. We had the 4th largest Hereford ranch in the world, the 6th largest Angus ranch, and 3 of the top 10 dairies in Texas. This is country. And country folk typically at that point in time, and some still today, we just don't get involved in politics. If you guys will just stay out of our hair and leave us alone, we've done this for hundreds of years. We don't need your help. And so I didn't have an affinity toward government at all, but faith was a different thing. Church, my parents were Christians. My dad was an engineer, but he's also a pastor, bivocational. So church, Bible, that was a big deal to me. And I remember going through elementary school, and, for folks that are not seeing this, I've got a lot of white hair. So that was a long time ago. And my 6th grade history teacher specifically told me, he said, George Washington had 26 illegitimate children, giving new meaning to the phrase that Washington slept here. So I thought, man, that's the founding fathers. I don't like those dudes. That's really bad. And then I went through time in school where we're taught they're atheists, agnostics, deists, and I thought they've got nothing to offer me. And what changed me was literally in dealing. I was a math and science guy. That was my scholarship in college there in Oklahoma. And so I was looking at correlations to see if there's a correlation between removing particular moral values from society and can you see a change in society with those moral values gone. And as I was going through Supreme Court cases, they said, well, we can't do this religious moral stuff because the founding fathers didn't want that. It's unconstitutional, separation church and state. And I was hearing that and I bought that. And I think probably the Lord just brought me up short one time, said, if the founders didn't want this, why did they wait till 1960 to take it out of culture? Because that's the first Supreme Court decision that said you can't have religion in public life. And I thought, that's a great question. Why did we go essentially 180 years before a court suddenly found the founding fathers didn't want this? How come nobody got it before that? And that's where I started looking back at the writings of the founding fathers. And when I did, I thought, oh my goodness, this is totally opposite to what I've ever been taught in school. I found one of the founding fathers involved in a Supreme Court case, was quoted in a case in 1844 where the U.S. Supreme Court said, look, if you're going to be a public school and get government funding, you're going to teach the Bible in schools. We're not going to have a government funded school that doesn't teach the Bible. I'm going, wait a minute, Supreme Court, unanimous decision, 1844, and they're quoting founding fathers like Francis Hopkinson and James Wilson. And by the way, I didn't know those were founding fathers at the time. I had to go back and look and say, hey, they signed the Constitution. So it all boiled down to, I didn't know anything about history, and it turned out most other Americans did not either. I was vicarious for most of them. And when we started seeing that and started going back to the originals, that's where it changed the discussion and the debates and changed my view on it. So as a Christian involved in stuff, I was at the thing that, Christians and politics don't mix. And then I started going back to the founding fathers and saying, oh, Christian politics do mix. 29 of the guys who signed the Declaration had graduated from theological seminaries. I mean, who says Christians can't be involved in politics? These guys were. And so that's where it changed for me, Senator, was seeing the history, going back and finding out that I've been taught wrong for decades, and most Americans have been taught wrong for decades.
Well, you cannot begin to talk about, please don't take this as over complimenting, but the work that you've done. My first exposure to you was shortly after being elected a few years ago. I was given you talk about separation church and state. That's the first thing that I ever saw that you had done. And I'd been given a couple pamphlets, so I didn't think much about it until I'd read it and enjoyed it, because honestly, that's how I believed, but did not really get a grasp on all the work that you've done for a couple more years. And it's for people that haven't looked at your work, just out of curiosity, you should go look, whether you go to Wall Builders or wherever you go, David. But I have to tell you this, you will appreciate this. So a couple of weeks ago, I did my very first podcast with a good friend of mine, I think it's a friend of yours, Congressman Josh Burkeen, who, by the way, when I said, Josh, give me 3 or 4 of your favorite books, you know what his number one book was? I think you know this. The Founders Bible, which is that work is just such a seminal work. It'll be around forever. It's such a great work. And I appreciate you coming to my rescue there, because I had misplaced the 2 copies that I have somewhere. So I appreciate that. But my favorite book that you've written is Jefferson Lies. Mm-hmm. And I tell you, I read that book and I didn't think that Jefferson was not a Christian anyway. I really didn't have a strong feeling about that. Mm-hmm. What caused you to write that? What was the impetus that caused you to write about that specific founding father and that book that I hesitate to ask you how long? I imagine it was years and years of research, but what caused you to write that book?
Yeah, Jefferson is the individual cited most often by people who don't want religion in society. And so whether it's the Supreme Court started it in 1947 when they said, hey, Thomas Jefferson gave us the wall of separation between church and state. We can't have Bible in schools or prayer schools or whatever. And so Jefferson has been the guy cited most often. As a matter of fact, I do a lot of legal work, been involved in 13 cases at the Supreme Court. And what we found is that in First Amendment cases involving religious expression, like "In God We Trust" on a building, or a nativity scene, or a cross on a cemetery, or whatever it is, invariably the court will cite the First Amendment because they're saying this is a First Amendment violation. But what's interesting is they cite, in those cases, Thomas Jefferson has been cited by the court 4,000 times. The First Amendment's been cited by the court only 3,000 times. So they're more likely to quote Thomas Jefferson than they are to quote the First Amendment, the Constitution itself, which they should be going to the Constitution every time as the number one source. But then the other thing about Jefferson is they only quote maybe one, sometimes two of his works, but the big one they quote is his letter that he did on separation of church and state, January the 1st, 1802. Now that letter, if you look, and we have it posted on our website, it's actually 3 paragraphs long. It's 233 words. It was written to one of his supporters. He just finished the presidential campaign. He won. It was a Baptist pastor who was supporting him, and Jefferson was writing him about religion. And in that letter, Jefferson, 233 words, 3 paragraphs, talks about how that, look, we will not have a secular public square. The reason we have the First Amendment is to make sure that we can have religion in public square, etc. And so what happens is the court, since 1947, has only quoted 8 Jefferson words out of a 233-word letter. And Jefferson's got tens of thousands of letters. They don't quote those. They quote 1 letter, 8 words, a wall of separation between church and state. And when they quoted that quote in 1947, they said the First Amendment's erected a wall of separation between church and state. We cannot approve the slightest violation. That's all they did. They didn't give any other history. They didn't quote the First Amendment. They didn't quote the Constitution. And so we have been stuck now with essentially 70 years of bad history coming out of a very poorly done case at the Supreme Court that didn't even quote history. And I know I've gone on a little bit here, but I'm going to jump in and say the rest. Hey, if Jefferson is your guy, then tell me why Jefferson authored the Plan of Education for Washington, D.C. public schools in 1801. And when he did so, he put the Bible and Watts hymnal in as the 2 reading texts in public schools. Tell me why Jefferson paid federal funds to send missionaries to the Kaskaskia Indians in the 1803 treaty that he did. And I can just keep going through all these public things that Jefferson did where he kept religion engaged in public. If you even go to the Jefferson Memorial today, there's 5 big quotes inside the Jefferson Memorial, 18-foot bronze statue of Jefferson. 4 of the 5 quotes are God-centered quotes. The guy was not secular. He was not trying to be secular. He was just making sure that the government couldn't stop religious expression, and we've done exactly opposite of what he wanted. So that's the long answer to a very short question you asked, but that's why things are happening differently today. The Supreme Court, since 2019, has gone back to actually reading original documents, citing all of Jefferson's letter, and that's why we're seeing such a change in the last 6 years of the U.S. Supreme Court. The Coach Kennedy decision, we can have prayer in schools, we can have God and trust back in public, we can do nativity scenes, we can teach creation science in the public school classroom. All these things we couldn't do for 70 years, we now can do again because we've gone back and rediscovered our history.
Well, I don't want to spoil everything in Jefferson Lies. I'm telling you, anybody that loves history, I one of my favorite books also is one called Vindicating Lincoln, because, you know, I don't know why, but around the time Obama got elected, there was this push by the left to demonize Lincoln. I never did understand. I still don't understand that. So, but Jefferson Lies is much, much better. But I do want to spoil one other thing, because I really love this intrigue around the Jefferson Bible. I mean, I think it's so intriguing. I mean, it's, you know, as parents, you know, when you have little kids, you go out and you buy them a book of Bible stories. And I'm not saying that Native Americans are children, but when it comes to English language and Christianity at that time, that might not be a necessarily negative thing. And so the Jefferson Bible I find so intriguing. It is one of the things that people throw at him as if they're throwing mud at a white wall. And would you mind just let us know what you think about the Jefferson Bible and how that fits into this whole narrative against Jefferson?
Yeah, Jefferson Bible, we're told today that Jefferson went through the Bible and cut out all the things he disagreed with, and he made a Bible he could agree with, and he cut out all the things from the divinity of Christ, the power of God, the miracles, etc. And that they get away with that because, quite frankly, we teach history so bad that we don't even know what's true. And so, oh, a PhD professor said that. He must know what he's talking about. No, he doesn't. It's really, and as you mentioned in the book, The Jefferson Lies, Jefferson actually did 2 Bibles in his lifetime. One was 1803, the other was 1820. And one was the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. The other was the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth. And the 1803, when he got in the White House in 1801, Jefferson he was just great friends with the Native Americans there in Virginia. They got along well, did a lot of stuff together. And so when he got in the White House, he got a letter from a missionary friend in Scotland. And he said, I was just in Scotland. And they were pointing out that if you're trying to take the gospel to people who don't know the gospel, like Native Americans, they don't know anything about Jesus. If you're trying to take the gospel, do not give them a Bible, because they might open it up to Leviticus, all the laws that go on and on and on with Moses, 613 laws, or they might open it up to something else that makes no sense. Just give them the teachings of Jesus. And so this minister sent Jefferson that sermon from Scotland. Jefferson read that and said, that's a great idea. Jefferson had 2 Bibles in the White House. He went through and started cutting out the red letters, is what we would say. They didn't have red letter editions back then, but he started cutting out the teachings of Jesus. And he he pasted it all into a small pamphlet. He sent that back to the guy and said, hey, here's something that will do exactly what you've talked about. This is the teachings of Jesus. And that's why he called it The Life of Jesus of Nazareth. And so it's the red letters of Jesus. Give this to the Native Americans. Let them read the words of Jesus. Let them read the Sermon on the Mount. Let them read all the things he said. This is the best way to introduce them to Jesus. And so that's what it was, until professors in the 1970s and 80s started saying, oh, look, he cut out all the stuff he disagreed with. No. Look at what he said. Let's take the things that Jesus taught, the seminal stuff, and let's make that available for him. And then later in life, as he had gone through, he was a philosopher. He read all the books, Cicero and Cato and all those guys that I don't even know how to get to their books today. He read all those classics, and he said, when you look at all the moral systems that are put out, the moral systems of the Romans, the moral system of the Greeks, etc., the morals of Jesus are better than any other moral system out there. And so what he did late in life was, in 1820, he took all the moral teachings of Jesus and pasted them end to end, but he did it in 4 languages. He had a polyglot. He did it in French. He did it in Latin and in Greek and in English. And so you can read the teaching, and people say, oh, he cut out all the miracles. No, he was going at the teachings of Jesus. He wasn't going at the miracles. He's saying, look at the philosophy of Jesus. And actually, in that first 1803 Bible, he actually has a number of miracles in there, a number of divine things that happen. So people today get Jefferson wrong, and we have been so poorly taught in history that we just repeat what we hear because we don't know anything different. And that's why we went back and actually got into what Jefferson said and did, his own writings and the final product he had. And the Jefferson Bible is not at all what we're told it is today in colleges and universities and by the critics.
No, I find it intriguing. I think it was very smart, and you're right. He was such an admirer of philosophy in general. And I think his moral teachings version is really about him saying that Jesus Christ was the superior,
that's right,
moral philosopher as well as Son of God. And so there is one other one that lately people have been throwing at me, and that's this Treaty of Tripoli, which I think is a disparaging treaty, if you ask me. I don't know why Congress would have done that, but do you have any insight on that, or is it just?
Yeah, that's a really significant one. And so the Treaty of Tripoli, it says it was done in 1797, 1799. John Adams was part of that, and Jefferson. And so it says the government of the United States is in no sense founded on the Christian religion. Now, that's the part they quote. What they don't quote is the rest of the treaty. So I've got to back you up for a little bit here. The Barbary powers were 5 Muslim nations in North Africa. One we call Libya today. That was called Tripoli back then. So the Treaty of Tripoli is a treaty that the United States made with the nation of Tripoli, which today is Libya. But there was a nation called Barca. There was one called Algiers and Tunis, which we know, Egypt. So there were 5, Egypt wasn't part of the 5, but there were 5 Muslim nations that had declared war on Christian nations. And Christian nations that they declared war on were France and England and Spain and Sweden and Denmark and America. And they said, this is a holy war. It's Christians against Muslims. And anytime they saw a flag from any of those 9 ships, their warships would attack those flags, would imprison and make slaves of the Christians on those ships. They may or may not have been Christians, but they came from Christian nations, and they held them in slavery. So there's about 1.2 million that were enslaved in those 9 nations. America had not been part of that because we didn't have overseas ships. And so what happens is once we finish the American Revolution in 1783, we signed the peace treaty. We start getting attacked as our ships are going over to Europe. They're getting attacked by these Muslim ships, and they're taking the crews, they're enslaving the crews, they're killing the Christian on the crews. And so at that point, Congress sent 3 diplomats over to talk to the Muslims and say, what's going on? And it was Ben Franklin, it was Thomas Jefferson, it was John Adams. They went over in 1783. They were there in 1784. And they're talking with the Muslim ambassador, and Adams and Jefferson write about this extensively. And he kept saying, well, our holy book says that we have to enslave you, that we have to conquer all of those who are not Muslims, and that's required by our holy book. And Adams and Jefferson go, wait a minute, you got a book, your Bible says that you have to kill and enslave people, which is so opposite from Christianity. Yeah. So they actually did not believe that. And so both of them went out in London, and that's where they were meeting the ambassador. They went out in London and bought a Quran. It's a 2-volume set. It was published in 1746. Adams has one, Jefferson has one. They said, we're going to read this for ourselves. So they read the Quran through cover to cover. Now, it's interesting. They got that Quran to see how crazy the teachings were. And when Keith Ellison of Minnesota was sworn in back 14 years ago as the first Muslim elected Congress, he chose to be sworn in on Jefferson's 1746 Quran. And in his swearing in, now he's now the Attorney General in Minnesota, but when he was sworn in then, he said, this proves the great influence of the Quran on Jefferson. No, it doesn't. It proves that Jefferson couldn't believe how crazy this book was, so he went and bought one himself. And the same with Adams. So then we start going to the individual Muslim nations and saying, hey, what is it going to take for you guys to not attack us anymore? And they said, well, if you'll pay the Muslim tax, the jizya, then we will not attack you as long as you're submitting to us economically. And so starting then, we started making big payments to Muslim nations to keep them from attacking, because we didn't have a navy. I mean, we were not going to get involved in anybody else's issues. We're America. We don't care about Europe. We don't care about Africa, anything else. And so we started paying these big amounts. By the time Washington got in office, 15% of the entire federal budget was being spent on these payments to these Muslim nations. Oh, and in Washington's 7th year out of his 8th year, he finally, Washington is the guy who said, do not get involved in foreign nations and foreign wars. Stay out of it. Stay with America. And in his 7th year, he said, would to heaven that I had a navy able to crush these enemies of mankind into non-existence. And so at that point in time, he asked Congress, fund me a navy. So for the first time, we started funding and building a navy. The Navy was built under John Adams, the next president, because Washington left office after 8 years. And Adams is called the father of the American Navy. He had the Navy built, and then he refused to go fight the Muslims with the Navy. And when they said, why? They said, you don't understand the Muslim mentality. This is not like fighting a war and winning. This is a life mentality. If we start fighting Muslims, we'll have to fight them the rest of our life and their lives, because this is the way they live. They live off fighting. And we don't want to get involved in a long war. And so Adams would not send the ships. When Jefferson got in 1801, he said, I'm sending the ships. So he took Stephen Decatur, a war hero. He took General Hull. He sent them to North Africa. And for 4 years, they went through and just thumped Muslims. Just the American Marines and the American Navy, we laid it on them. And so they signed a treaty with us. So that treaty lasts. And then we get involved in the War of 1812. And by the way, before we sent the Navy is when the Treaty of Tripoli occurred. And the Treaty of Tripoli is actually, that clause, the 11th article, is actually 87 words long, and they just quote these 13 words. They quote the government of the United States is in no sense founded on the Christian religion. What the treaty actually says, the government of the United States is in no sense founded on the Christian religions of Europe that have an inherent hostility against Muslims, that believe you should fight the Muslims in war. So what they're saying is, look, we're not one of the Christian nations that you had in Europe that are always fighting you guys. We don't think we should be fighting you. We're not one of those Christian nations. And so that's what the treaty actually says, and everybody just quotes that line from it. And so when they wouldn't give us peace, we went and set the military. Then after we had peace, we got involved in the War of 1812. And in the War of 1812, the Muslims say, you know what? They can't fight a war on two fronts. Let's attack them again. And so they started coming after us and enslaving our people and killing our captains and ships. And so then as soon as we finished the War of 1812, Madison sends the Navy back over to the Muslim nations and whoop them again. We've fought Muslim nations for 32 years. From the time of the end of the revolution, for 32 years, we had to deal with that. And finally, in 1816, we got them to submit, and we had peace for a long period of time. So that silly Treaty of Tripoli that everybody quotes, it's a tiny little cog in a big story. And when you see the whole big story, it doesn't mean what they say it means. And it doesn't mean what they say it means if you just read the entire paragraph.
Read the whole
they
passage.
Just take a clause. And so that's another thing where people get it all wrong today.
They do. And I thanks for that, David. That's awesome.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to go into a monologue. There's a monologue actually. So sorry about that, but it's a fun story when you look at it.
No, it is. I find all this, I listen to some podcasts these days that, not a big listener, but I listen to some and I enjoy the conspiracy ones sometimes.
Yeah.
Because some of them are so crazy. It's like, how do you believe that? Well, it's on the internet. Oh, thanks. That really makes it all good. But if you go back and look at the actual history, so I want to get back, I want to talk about some of your books, but I want to get back to what I mentioned at the beginning, because I think in the past I've seen where you support Convention of States to try to rein in an out of control federal government. And for some reason, I don't know why a lot of these opposition folks are friends of mine. I mean, we're good friends. Some of them go to wall builders, too, and then they come back and oppose, and that's fine. I always appreciate opposition. I really, really do. I mean, if you're doing something where everybody is kumbaya, you might rethink what you're doing, because there's usually somebody opposing. But some of the things that are going on these days bother me, and most of it's about the founding.
Yeah.
And so I know you've researched and studied that and written about it. Whether it's one of your books like Original Intent or some of your other great books from that time. But this one thing really bugs me that they keep mischaracterizing in my mind. I thought you might even be able to explain it better. So there's this Madison letter. I know you know the one I'm thinking about. I don't know if he published it or how exactly it became public, but where he cautioned or expressed fear about going back into convention, 1788, I think somewhere around that time. What is your thoughts on that and this whole idea of the founders, creating a document that they weren't allowed to, and the runaway convention, all these thoughts? But I want to start with this Madison letter. Yeah. That one is interesting.
Yeah, the Madison letter, and there are several that are part of it. And again, this is what happens if you take part of one letter and stick on it and don't read the rest of it. Because Madison is also involved in doing Article 5 of the Constitution. Article 5 of the Constitution is what allows the Congress to introduce constitutional amendments, or for the states to go around Congress and do their own constitutional amendments. So what has happened is, over the course of American history since 1789, talking about constitutional amendments, there have been, as of when Trump took office, it was just under 12,000 constitutional amendments that have been introduced in the United States. So everybody's got an idea on what it should be changed for. 33 of those amendments have actually made it to the states to be voted on. 27 have passed. One of the amendments that's been out there for a number of years is called the Balanced Budget Amendment. It takes 34 states to say, let's have a balanced budget amendment. And we've had 35 states call for it, but how come we haven't voted on it? It's because several states keep rescinding the calls. They say, oh, wait, we don't want a balanced budget after all, because in Keynesian economics, goes back to FDR, the belief is the more you spend, the more prosperity you have. Ignore debt, ignore inflation. Spending is really good for the economy. And that's true, but at some point, the turkeys come home to roost, and you're going to have to deal with the mess that they leave. and that's you're now 33 trillion in debt, and you're going to have to pay that at some point in time, more than 35, I guess now. And at some point in time, inflation keeps going up. If we were still on the gold standard, we would be paying the same price George Washington paid for clothes back in his day, because you don't have inflation when you have that gold and silver standard, and we got off that in the 70s. So this Keynesian economics is this always evolving thing. And so with it, we've gotten to the point where that when we look at constitutional amendments, we can't even get a balanced budget amendment passed right now. As deep in debt as we are, we can't even get the nation to agree that we ought to limit our spending to what we take in. So I say that to say the chances of getting any constitutional amendment passed are slim to none. And so what happens is a conspiracy on the other side that says, hey, if we were to open up a constitutional convention through the states, which has never been done, all the other amendments came through Congress, which Article 5 authorizes. But Article 5 also says if Congress won't do it, the states can do it. And so that's what a convention, a call of convention is the states can get together and say, hey, we want to call another constitutional convention, just like they did way back in 1787 at Independence Hall when they had a constitutional convention, except it's always been for the purpose of having one or two or three things. So the conspiracists say, man, if you do that, you could end up writing a brand new constitution, just like they did back then, because they were supposed they went in that convention. They're just supposed to amend the Articles of Confederation, and they came out with a whole new constitution. They could do that to us today. Well, there's problems with that, because if they did that, you're still going to have to get it ratified by 34 states, and there's not 34 states that are going to agree to throwing out the Constitution. So this is where I go back to. There's a great verse in Isaiah 8, chapter 8, verse 11 through 13, where God says, "Don't call conspiracy everything they call conspiracy. Don't fear what they fear. Don't dread what they dread." And there's a tendency that when you get into a conspiracy theory, fear is what drives you rather than logic or confidence or anything else. And so the Constitutional Convention, I've been on the National Republican platform. I helped write that the last 5 times. And each time that we have the hearings for people to have something in the National Republican platform, there are people who want to have a resolution condemning any convention of the states convention. And I've always fought that, because you're telling me that you're going to condemn Article 5 of the Constitution, because Article 5 is what tells you have the right to do this. So you want me to put in the Republican platform a resolution that condemns the U.S. Constitution? I ain't doing that. I believe in the Constitution. I think I think it's just short of inspired. The Bible's inspired. This is the next closest document I think that God had a hand in. And it's lasted, all these now 250 years we celebrate as a nation. Nobody's got close to that. So I have always resisted any temptation to say that we should condemn what the Constitution allows in terms of this Convention of States. So there's rules out there. People have conspiracies. Man, if we get into that, the blue states are going to take it over and they're going to abolish the Constitution. They can't do it unless 34 states agree with them. And that's just not going to happen in this culture, especially now. Last 3 years, we've seen patriotism on the rise. We've seen states starting to love the Constitution again. We're seeing schools teach it. We're seeing things go in the right direction. So that's, kind of again, I'm giving you long answers today, Senator. Sorry about that.
No, it's good, David. No, good stuff.
That's the background on it.
So this idea that the founders, one is there's so many on the left that take things out of context. They'll take a sentence, they'll take one, a partial phrase out of a letter or whatever to try to condemn our founders or make them sound like deists or atheists, or, they'll mention Thomas Paine. I'm like, I don't think he was a founder, but yes, he was an atheist. He repented in the end. That's probably a good thing. But anyway, so they'll do that. And it bothers me, because I always see that as a weapon of the left. And so when I see that, we see that from our, I would say, friends, our own conservatives will say, okay, well, I'm going to take this Madison letter, or I'm going to take this, when we could read Madison's words in totality and see that, yeah, he liked this concept of nullification, but at the end of the day, the states in plurality had to act underneath Article 5 to actually succeed in that. Mm-hmm. And so Oklahoma was kind of point of discussion a couple of weeks ago on that.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. Have you written a book? I know you've written on the founders. Have you written a book that's based on, or that's about the Constitutional Convention itself?
Yes.
Analyzing that?
We have articles on the website that deal with that and with the call to it. And by the way, right now, the call for the Convention of the States is being led by the conservative red states. It's not being led by the blue states. There's not even been a blue state that wants to even talk about it at this point. And quite frankly, I support that because the Constitution supports that. Do I think it's going to happen? I don't think we can get 34 states to agree on anything right now. We can't even get them to agree that there's only two genders. 29 states have done laws saying, hey, we're going to protect women and men's sports, and 21 states say, not us. We think that there's no male and female. We can't even agree on something that fundamental. And you tell me that we're going to get somehow these 34 states together to get rid of the Constitution? We can't agree on anything at this point. And so I'm not worried about a runaway convention, because I don't think we can have a convention, although I'm working to help, that there are some proposed amendments, and those amendments are like term limits for judiciary, which I don't have problems with no term limits for judiciary, because the Constitution didn't do that. And we never needed it until we let the progressives take over the law schools and say that judges are unaccountable. There's 7 clauses in the Constitution on how to get rid of activist judges. It's just that nobody reads the Constitution anymore. So right now, it's a big debate over having the convention. I'm for it because the Constitution's for it. I don't think it's going to happen because we can't even agree on what truth is at this point. We can't agree, again, on genders, but I think it's a good tool. And what we've seen before, and this is what's always cool, is on the balanced budget amendment, when it got close to calling a convention, the state starts saying, wait, we'll pass the constitutional amendment out of the state, like Illinois and others. And so that's how we got close to that, was they didn't want to go into the convention. Therefore, it motivated the states to start doing something. And that might happen again. But, again, the fear that is out there that motivates the conspiracy is often, as fear often is, it's often illogical. And there's no basis in fact or history for that, except that you've taken, like the progressives do with Jefferson, you take 8 words of separation church and state out of his letter of 233 words and make it say something it didn't say. And that's kind of where we are on the Convention of States to some degree.
Yeah, I read a recent article that in Ohio, they have a law penalizing parents if they don't recognize transitioning kids and all that. And I said, Ohio. I mean, just like you say, even those states where you have confidence in, to some extent, they're like passing these crazy laws that, I mean, why would you ever undermine a parent and, in my opinion, condemn a child to a life of confusion and pain?
Yeah.
Do that, and you would codify that? That doesn't make any sense. But so when we go back,
there's actually several states this year that have a parental rights amendment on the states. And it goes back to a 1926 Supreme Court decision that says it's the fundamental right of a parent to direct the education, upbringing of their children. So Pierce versus Society Sisters, the court just said, hey, we all know this. And so now you have states saying, hey, that needs to be a parental rights amendment in our state constitution. And at this point, we can't even get the red states to pass that amendment saying that parents should be in charge of their kids. And it's been a very tough amendment. And so it's on several state ballots this year. But even getting the red states to agree that parents should be able to direct the education, upbringing of their children, that's even a hard sell right now in America, which is kind of a crazy thing to say.
Well, before I left office, I tried for several years to pass a cause of action for adult kids of this transitioning. I think you're going to see more and more of the coming decades of 40-year-olds and 35-year-olds that say, you know what, somebody ought to be liable for where I'm at. And they have truth. I mean, it's how parents or guardians or physicians can do this to these young people. I don't get it. But
well, 2 weeks ago was the first big decision, several million 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
And then this week, they've approved 2 more cases to go forward on more detransitioners that are suing. And it's not that I rejoice that the doctor and the psychiatrist or psychologist are going to be penalized millions. I rejoice in the fact that the courts are actually upholding the fact that, look, Biological science was really simple on this, and you should have been able to follow the science and not lead these kids astray. What you did is against all science. And so I was pleased with the fact that the courts went back to there is actually truth. And what you think in your mind is not always truth. And what you as a plastic surgeon and what you as a psychologist did was not based on absolute truth. And so I don't rejoice that they're having to pay millions in this settlement. I rejoice in the fact that the court said there is a standard of truth, and you need to hold that standard up, whether you're a medical guy or, whether you're a surgeon or a psychologist. And that's what I'm rejoicing in, is now we're getting back to some accountability on fairy tales and fairyland. And you may believe in Peter Pan, but I'm sorry, he doesn't exist. And that's what I think is really healthy for the nation, is we're getting back to saying there is absolute truth, and it can be determined, and it's not individually determined. There is objective standards, and I think that's really healthy.
And I think that takes us down the path of maybe slowing this down, because I felt like it was on a roller coaster, and mainly it was trapping kids. Of course, now's the brainwashing on the ice. They're not going to go get ices. They're going to teach these kids that ice is bad and they don't even know what they're talking about. But so we have Jefferson Lies, which is a great book. But I actually got your audio a while back of your George Washington book. It's a short book, but I listened to a lot of books, and having Dean Jones narrate that was pretty cool, I thought.
Yeah, that's right.
So how's that book doing? I really enjoyed that book. How's that one?
It's done really well. It's now actually appearing in textbooks. For example, here in Texas, we're in the process of revisioning all of our public school textbooks. We do that every 12 to 14 years. Most states do it every 8 to 10 years. And actually, that Bulletproof George Washington story is now back in the textbooks. It's a really cool historical story. And it's one that had fallen off the table, and getting deep. Look, I mentioned before, I got some white hair. I go back to the old classic Walt Disney movies before they were woke in any way. And, Dean Jones was just their stable actor. And I love Dean Jones in Disney movies. And so having him do the Bulletproof George Washington story was just an awesome experience, quite frankly.
Yeah, I could see that being one of those Disney movies back in the day, something like that. But and I haven't read your American Story books, but they remind me of, I don't know if you're familiar with Jeff Shihara, that wrote a 2-part series, which is really good. So I'm anxious to read those. Now on this, do you have any current books? Are you working on anything, or is your son working on any current books that we might?
We're in the process of finishing one right now for the 250th, and it's the 56 signers of the Declaration. Tim and I both speak all across the nation, universities, and Tim's got this little thing where he's got a gift card, and at the university he'll hold it up and say, I'll give this gift card to anybody who can name 5 signers of the Declaration. He's had the same gift card for 9 years. Nobody knows those guys. So here we are on the 250th, and the best we can do is we think we can come up with Jefferson and Franklin, but we don't even know those. And that's why we did the Jefferson Lies, is people, what they think about Jefferson is not even what actually happened. So what we're doing in this is just telling really cool stories of what happened with those 56, and because they're not superheroes. They're just ordinary people who had a great commitment to do something. And their stories of courage, how many of them actually voluntarily died defending what they wanted us to have, how many lost every penny they owned, paying so that we could have freedom. It's just cool stories of sacrifice. And I have yet to find a single founding father who complained about the price he paid to do what he did, which says a lot about them. So we're having fun. We're finished, just even as we're talking right now, I've got guys next door doing research on some tidbits we found that we want to add in, but it'll be a fun biographical kind of look at the founding fathers rather than a philosophical or academic look. Who are these guys? What did they do? How is it you can have 18 kids in a family back then, which they did, or some of them have no kids at all. They're just so different. And it's really cool to see that group of 56.
It's so different, because back then you saw, I know we got a lot of Trump haters out there, and I seem to attract a few of them, but we have people will say, well, Trump's rich, all this stuff. But back in the day, when people did public service, they typically lost money. And I would say that's true today. I mean, if with people that have true servants' hearts that do public service today usually do lose money if they had it already. But today we have so many people go in poor and come out rich. It's so bizarre.
Yeah.
And some in our own party, to be fair, but I think that's just despicable to me. I just can't imagine using my role in the government to get myself richer. But I do want to say, you mentioned the founders, and somebody always throws this back at me too. Well, they were all Masons. They were all Freemasons, so that makes them evil. So, have you researched any of that to uncover whether this was some deep, dark Freemasonry thing where our whole country is now answerable to some devil buried down in some deep cave somewhere?
Yes, sir. We actually have a book on that. It's called Freemasonry and the Founding Fathers. And Freemasonry came to America in really the 1730s and 40s. It was in Europe for a long time, but there was what was called speculative masonry and operative masonry. And Freemasonry in Europe a long time was operative masonry. That is, you were actually building stone mason stuff. And so Freemasons at that time were like what we would call a union today. They were a guild of craftsmen. And back then you had these castles that you'd build for 700 years, and you had all these forts and et cetera. And so Freemasons back then were those who laid the stone and could handle it. But it changed with Shakespeare. Shakespeare said, man, if I build a theater, it's going to take years for him to build it. If I build it in wood, I can build it in 1 year. And so Shakespeare built the Globe Theater, and suddenly everybody said, hey, why are we doing stone that takes hundreds of years? We can do wood. And it changed the whole building. And so over there at that point in time, you suddenly had all these union members who were out of jobs because everything's going to wood. And at that point, some of the rich Europeans got involved and said, man, in our classes, we never get to interact with the common people. Why don't we kind of adopt these Masons that are out of a job? And so that became speculative masonry. Guys that didn't have a clue how to use a hammer, a chisel, or anything else started saying, hey, we can spiritualize all this. We can spiritualize the trestle board. We can spiritualize. The level means the equality of all mankind, and the trestle board means the brotherhood of man. We're all mixed together. And so that became speculative masonry. Well, that was brought to America in 1734 by Ben Franklin when he returned from England. And it was kind of a charitable organization. And at that point in time, we get into the French and Indian War. And because England still had classes and we were still English, we're British. When the British military got here in 1755 in the French and Indian War, they would not even talk to people like George Washington and others because he's one of those colonials. And so General Edward Braddock has Colonel Washington under him, can't talk to him. And that's where most founding fathers at that time got involved in the Masonic Lodge, because at that time, that's the only way that everyone was equal. You could go into the Masonic Lodge and the officers could talk with the soldiers. Outside of that, you couldn't. But there was nothing spiritual about it at all. That spiritual aspect that people object to today came much, much later. So you have some founding fathers, actually only about 14 of the founding fathers were Masons, but more than half of them became Masons in the French and Indian War. And so then as time goes on, you get into Masonry becoming a secret organization. It kind of starts looking like the Illuminati. There's a sermon preached in America, 1798, 1799, that the Masons are a secret organization like the Illuminati in France. That sent Thomas Jefferson off. Jefferson, who was not a Mason, said, we got to find out if that's true. And so Jefferson did extensive government investigation to see if there was any kind of underground movement. And he wrote the preacher and he told the preacher, he said, I can't find that. He said, well, I was talking about Europe. I wasn't talking about America. And Jefferson said, well, your sermon's published in America, and it made it look like we had this underground movement going. And the underground movement didn't start until 1825 with the murder of Capital Daniel Morgan, Batavia, New York, where the Masons had come up with that point with degrees and oaths on every degree, and you take an oath, and they're abominable oaths. And so what happened was at that point in time, the anti-Masonic party started in America. John Quincy Adams was the leader of that. He got elected to Congress in the anti-Masonic party. You had governors of Vermont and New Jersey and others who are anti-Masons. So it's a big deal. And where Masonry really goes bad in terms of Christian belief is when you get into the 1840s with morals and dogmas, and people like Albert Pike and Albert Mackey, they rewrote Masonry. It had been a Christian organization for many, many, many years. It became a secular organization, and then it became an organization with, if you choose a Scottish rite, the fourth to the 32nd degree, you learn essentially about a different religious belief in each degree, and it became very pluralistic. And no longer is it Christian beliefs. It's, we believe in the occult, we believe in dualism, we believe in etc. And so that's where Masonry, people today, there's a lot of young people in Masonry that think it's just a club. And I have yet to meet a Mason in America who's ever read the materials he's been given when he became a Mason, which if he read them, he wouldn't agree with them. But it seems like a civic club. And you got the Shriners who do all these good things for kids, and the Shriners Hospital help all these kids. And most people just don't know. But that the book that we did actually goes back. We own so many of the original Masonic documents all the way up through the 1920s and 30s. So we have a massive library of Masonic materials, and we just kind of do that book on Freemasonry, the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers were not big Freemasons. Washington said he'd only been in a lodge 7 or 8 times his entire life and hadn't been in a lodge since the French and Indian War. So in 1796 and 7, when people were asking him, he said, I'm not a Mason. I used to be, but I needed that to talk to the British officers. So people are really confused about that today. And of course, the Masons take a lot more credit for stuff than is deserved, because again, they haven't read most of their own books that they're given. But people can find out about, if you're concerned about the Founding Fathers being Masons, I encourage you to read the book Freemasonry and the Founding Fathers at Wall Builders.
Okay, yeah, I recommend that as well. I have not read that. I'll have to pick that one up. But I'm always intrigued by these conspiracy theories. You know, you have the Catholic Church conspiracy theory, the Black Pope, all of these different things. Well, sure appreciate your time, David, very, very much. And I do want to follow through. We talked a little bit about having maybe the Freedom Caucus down there here in Oklahoma, and I want to follow through on that at some point down the road. But is there any other thoughts, any other projects you're working on that you want to talk about, or any other issues?
You know, one of the things that we're doing a lot on is the 250th. And so we're working with the White House on that. I think we're doing 27 or 37 events with the Department of Education. Actually, 4 cabinet level departments have asked us to help them with stuff. And what I'm really pleased with is they want the faith element of America back out for Americans to know. And that's really what made us great. And when people say Christians shouldn't be involved in politics, I just say it's good for you. The Founding Fathers didn't believe that, because you have so many Christians involved there. And if it had not been for Christians being involved in politics, we wouldn't have the nation we have. And that's what you get when you go back and read those original documents. There's 1,400 prayer proclamations that they issued by 1815, official prayer proclamations by the government. And I don't know that I've heard a Christian sermon in 50 years that is as strong theologically as John Hancock's prayer proclamations are, or Sam Adams' prayer proclamations, or others. So I would encourage folks to really rediscover the roots of America, the faith roots of America particularly. And that's projects that we're working on with these cabinet level departments. And I'm very grateful that that's happening. I'm also grateful for the fact that the Supreme Court in the last 6 years has dumped nearly 5,000 previous anti-religion decisions that they made over the last 40 years. So we are in a different era. We just need people to be aggressive and go forward with that. And you guys in Oklahoma, Senator, you guys have done a great job taking advantage of what the courts have now given us again, going back to that, getting that back in public life. And that's, I hope, where America goes, is back towards some of the good things that have made us who we were for the last 250 years.
Yeah, I really do get discouraged sometimes on social media when I see so many people deny God, actually hate on God and hate on Christ. I hope that what that is, because you don't know what social media is, my hope is that is such a small, piddling amount. I would encourage everybody that, pick up, if you don't think, Christianity was intertwined in our founding and many years since then, and through the Lincoln era, all those times, like you said, we wouldn't be the country we are. We wouldn't have the freedoms that we have if not for those Christian beliefs and Judeo-Christian beliefs that our founders believed in. Yeah. But go to Wall Builders, check it out, and definitely get Jefferson Lies, get Original Intent, and download the audiobook of the Bulletproof George Washington. You'll really enjoy it. And David, it's been a real pleasure always. And one last thing I forgot to mention, I don't know if you recall this, but when I first got elected, you and I met. I think it was in Charleston's restaurant. It's a lot. You met with millions of lawmakers, but I'll never forget it because I was just a newbie, very much a newbie. And I tried to get my chairman at the time. I don't want to besmirch him, but try to get him. We were talking about getting Bible study in schools, which I think, thanks to you and others, that is happening and has happened some. But what ended up morphing out of that lunch was a bill to give, grade school children the chance to say the Pledge of Allegiance again, which was being taken away from some kids in Oklahoma.
That's right.
So I appreciate you, and I thank you, and I recognize you as instrumental in getting that legislation and thousands of others like that. So thank you for your service to God, your service to nation, and everything else, David. Appreciate you very much.
Thanks, Senator. And thanks for your service and your boldness in Oklahoma. You guys have done great things. Thank you, brother.
Appreciate it. See you, David. Well, it was such a pleasure to have David Barton on. David is such a good man, and Wall Builders does a lot of good for legislators all around the country, and appreciate the work that they do. Again, I would encourage you to go to wallbuilders.com, check it out, all the books. I see American Story up on the screen now. Also, I would encourage you to take a look at my two books. I have 2084, which you can find on Amazon. 2084, Trump and the Bill of Freedoms. Also have Meth Cartel, which should be out soon. And if you have any questions or comments, please go to my Facebook page or my X page or wherever you would like to visit about anything. Anyway, God bless everybody. God bless the great state of Oklahoma and the greatest nation on earth, the United States of America. Thank you.